for the invitation to speak here. So in the following, I'll talk a bit about the benefit of polyhedral theory on the feasible regions in classical data analysis problems. So let me show you some fundamentals of the type of data analysis that I'm talking about. So one of the fundamental tasks is to cluster, to partition a data set, an unlabeled data set like you see here. And what popular algorithms actually do is they impose a cell complex in the space of the data points, which they then use to partition the data set by the cells of that cell complex. So that is a very geometric interpretation of a really popular concept that has a lot of different names, like multi-class support vector machines or piecewise linear separability. So essentially, this is built on the idea of separating each cluster, each pair of clusters linearly, but also partitioning the space. And that's how you end up with a cell complex. Okay, so before I want to go to the partition polytopes that I'm going to focus on, I want to explain what these cell complexes are and what these corresponding clusterings are. So first, let's talk about these cell complexes. So those are power diagrams. A power diagram is formed by specifying a set of sites and a radius for each of these sites, and then drawing the balls of these different radii around them. And then you can define a distance function that separates the underlying space into cells that are closest to the respective sites. But what's different from a classical Voronoi diagram is that this measure of distance is additively distorted by the radius around the respective site. So the points that are equally far from the green cluster, sorry, the green cell and the red cell here are precisely those points on the joint intersection of those two unit balls. So algebraically, a cell complex is a tuple of k cells, polyhedral cells, that are closest with respect to this so-called power function. So a classical squared Euclidean distance to the site, and then taking into the account the different radii around the cells. So power diagrams are a representation of almost all polyhedral cell complexes. So except for some really technical examples, all simple cell complexes can be represented in this fashion. So these are the types of cell complexes that we put in a data space. And they are in an intimate connection to so-called balanced least squares assignments. So for least squares assignments, you also specify a set of sites and you minimize the least squares term, where you sum up over all clusters and you sum up over all points in those clusters, and you measure the squared Euclidean distance from that point to its corresponding site. So that would be a classical least squares assignment. Now, a balanced least squares assignment is a relaxation of this concept. It's a weaker concept. You don't have to be globally optimal among all possible assignments of points to clusters, but actually you only have to be optimal among all clusterings that have the same number of points in each of its clusters. So those are the direct competitors that you have to beat. And the connection between balanced LSAs and power diagrams, separating power diagrams, is essentially one-to-one. So each balanced LSA A allows one to draw a power diagram such that each cluster has its own cell. And if you draw the power diagram first and then cluster the data based on the cells, that's going to be a balanced least squares assignment as well. And there are more details to this correspondence. The sites for the power diagrams and the least squares assignments will coincide as well. So this has been known for a long time, and that's very important for what I'm going to talk about. So, but before I become a bit more technical, I need to go through a bit of notation, just real quick. I will call the data set that we work on capital X. When I talk about clustering, I always talk about the partition of X into K clusters. I'm going to care about the cluster size, denoted with these absolute bars around CI, the number of items in that cluster. When I want to talk about the clustering, all the sizes of clusters of a clustering as a whole, that's the clustering shape. It's just a tuple of that information. And I want to work in a setting where it's possible to specify lower and upper bounds on clusters, on cluster sizes that would give feasible clustering shapes. So the types of problems that I'm interested in are those where we're given a data set, it's specified how many clusters you're supposed to create, and you're told what the lower bounds and upper bounds on these cluster sizes are, and then you have to find some clustering of feasible shape. And I'm not specifying what the objective function is here. We'll get into that a bit later. So this is a generalization of typical clustering tasks. If you specify trivial bounds here, like a lower bound of 0 or 1, and upper bounds of just the number of items, you would have clustering tasks that do not underlie cluster size restrictions. Okay, so let's take some first steps. Yes.
Yeah, so
yes.
What are the feasibility constraints here, like on the clustering?
So, you know what? I think this becomes quite clear with the next slide here and the mathematical programming formulation, because I literally specify the constraints here, and I'll talk through them. All right, so let's make sure that we agree on what we're talking about. So the first steps for a computation of a balanced least squares assignment are actually pretty straightforward. Some standard techniques. You would use decision variables that indicate whether an item xj is associated to cluster ci. And if so, you choose a 1. If not, you choose a 0. And that means for fixed sites, we're searching for an optimal vertex over a polyhedral region, which are called T for transportation polytope, because the constraints that we form here are very similar to a classical transportation problem. So the types of constraints are the number of items in each cluster is at least the prescribed lower bound, and at most the prescribed upper bound for each cluster. Each item is assigned, and actually this is a TU matrix, and this right-hand side information is integral, so don't have to keep the 0, 1 here, just yij greater or equal 0. So I hope that made sense about what the feasible set is. So it's the clusterings of the appropriate of the allowed cluster size. And this is actually an LP, because for fixed sites S and the fixed data set that we're given, this is just a number. So this is a linear expression. So if sites are fixed, this is quite easy and nice to approach with linear programming, but we can do much better. And for that, I want to get into the partition polytopes. So two terms that I will need for the definition of those polytopes are the cluster sum. So Pi for cluster Ci is the sum of all coordinates of items assigned to the cluster. So just sum up all of the geographical locations and then collect them in a large vector, or if you like, in a matrix. Just write them all together. This is going to give a clustering vector. And now a partition polytope is given data set, the number of clusters to form, and the lower and upper bounds on cluster sizes. It's the convex hull of clustering vectors of feasible clustering shapes. So the convex hull of all clustering vectors that you can form for feasible clustering. Okay, so my main goal here is to show why it's so useful to look at these.
Do you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, please go ahead.
So this clustering vector is actually a matrix?
It doesn't matter how you write it. So
yeah, sure. But like, yeah, like P1 is a vector itself, right?
Yes, exactly. So it consists of k parts.
Yeah.
And each of those itself is a d-dimensional vector. Good. Where d would be the dimension of the data set.
Yeah.
Good question. Yes. So we essentially glue them all together. Okay. So my main goal here is to exhibit why it's so useful to talk about these polytopes, to study these polytopes and look at their vertices, look at their edges, look at their circuits. So let's take a first step here. Let's say the cluster sizes are prescribed exactly. So kappa minus is the same as kappa plus. So what one can then show then is that if you form a least squares term for a least squares assignment, that's actually the same as just summing up as I transpose Pi. So the difference between these two terms is just a constant based on the coordinates of the sites and the coordinates of the data points. So what this means is for a single shape partition polytope, so wherever one has exact cluster sizes, balanced least squares assignments are optimal with respect to linear optimization with respect to the sites as a direction. So you optimize linearly in direction of the sites. And this is something that we've known for a long time. So if you then go to an optimal vertex, each item of this polyhedron, each item is uniquely assigned. So that's a characterization of C being a balanced least squares assignment. So a clustering is a balanced least squares assignment if and only if it is a vertex of the partition polytope of the clusterings that all have the same sizes. And you can actually generalize this to the setting where you have different lower and upper bounds, but then it's not an if and only if relationship. So a vertex of this polyhedron, of this convex hull, is still going to be a balanced least squares assignment, but not all balanced least squares assignments are actually vertices of that polyhedron. You can see this by noting that this partition polytope is essentially a convex hull of the partition polytopes for these single shapes. Okay, so, and in turn, the computation, the optimization of a partition polytopes, it's just as simple as it was for the balanced least squares assignment. So what you can do is optimize in direction of the sites over the polyhedron and you will find a balanced least squares assignment. Now, the algebra for optimizing over this partition polytope, which is given just as a convex hull and is not in a good form for working with it, is done over the transportation polytope that corresponds to it. And I know that there are many people here that like extended formulations. So the transportation polytope is an extended formulation of the partition polytope, or it's a linear projection, and a correspondence between optimal vertices of T and optimal vertices of P. That's essentially a direct correspondence, some technicalities, but you can, the punchline is you can do the algebra over the extended formulation. Okay, so why is it useful then to think about these partition polytopes when the computation, the linear optimization over those polytopes is essentially just the same as computing a balanced least squares assignments trade-off? So because of interpreting this feasible set as a polyhedral region, we now, and knowing that balanced least squares assignments are vertices, we can now, for example, look at the normal cones with respect to this partition polytope. So if we go to the single shape partition polytope, then the normal cone of a vertex is going to be precisely the collection, the set of all side vectors for which the clustering is a balanced least squares assignment. So we're now able to talk about the set of sites for which we would be optimal. And this has a couple of consequences, but the first immediate one is that having a large normal cone in its own right is a sound criterion for a good clustering, a robust clustering. So we can go into a bit of detail here. So these normal cones actually specify polyhedral regions in the underlying data space in which you can move the sites around that would give the same balanced least squares assignment. And so you can actually map out the information from the normal cones in the original data space. And the fatter, the bigger these regions are, the better. So this actually explains why some popular algorithms like k-means work so well in practice. So k-means is essentially the iterative computation of a least squares assignment, and then you change the sites around and you compute a new least squares assignment with respect to the new sites and so on. So the vertices of the partition polytope, so this is the same as iterative linear optimization over the partition polytope. So with that point of view, the clusterings that are most likely to be found are also the best ones, the ones with the large normal cones. I think there's a question.
Yeah, I was just curious. I think there are these like k-means algorithms where you iterate back and forth between the sites and the clusters, but those don't like preserve the cluster sizes, right? I guess, I mean, in the polytope that you were looking at, you wanted fixed cluster sizes, is that right?
So the measure for the best measure for the normal cone comes from the fixed cluster size.
Okay.
And that's a very good question. Now the normal cones if you look at the same vertex and it happens to be a vertex of the partition polytope with different lower and upper bounds, going to be smaller. But if that one is still large, then you still have a criterion. But that's a very good question. So you have the exact match between sites that work for this clustering in the single shape case. And and this information becomes a slight bit flawed if you let the cluster sizes vary. It's a very good question.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so, well, to be honest, so there's something more to say about these normal cones before I go to the big challenges that we're currently working on. So when you know the normal cone, you can actually also talk about the concept of what would be best sites for a given clustering. So what one, for example, could do is take a unit ball and roll it into that normal cone. That's a classical concept in computational geometry. And the best sites would then be the center vector, so the vector that goes to the center point of that unit ball. These are not simple mathematical programs to solve. So they're at least quadratic. There's no convexity. So these are not easy to solve, but they would give an idea of what the best sites can be in practice. But we actually face an even harder challenge. So I'm talking about how nice and great this normal cone is and what you can do if you know that normal cone. Well, we don't know. It's actually pretty hard to get it. So we are working over the partition polytope that only has a convex hull representation. Yes, it's a linear projection of a nice polytope that we understand very well. But that transportation polytope has no information about the locations of the data set in the space. That's all contained in that projection. So we don't immediately get what this normal cone looks like from the extended formulation. So what can we do? Well, we can try and characterize it through finding the inner cone and taking the polar. So we are interested in the edges of this polyhedron so that we can do all of the nice things that I talked about before. Okay, so an explicit representation of this inner cone would build on a characterization of the edges. And for this, we need two types of information. We need to know the set of circuits. So we've had several talks where these came up. I'll be brief here. So the potential edge directions. And we also need to find out which of these directions are actually realized at the particular vertex that we're considering. So as a reminder, there are different ways to think about circuits. If you're not familiar with it, the algebraic one is probably a bit cumbersome, and it's best to think about the set of circuits as the one-dimensional intersections of the facets and the hyperplanes in the description of a polyhedron if you put everything through the origin. So, okay, so what do we need? The set of circuits and which of these directions are realized at PC. But there's actually something that we know straight up from what we've seen before. The fact that balanced least squares assignments, the computation of those is the same as linear optimization over the polytopes. I want to go to this third point here. So two adjacent vertices of a partition polytope, they share the optimal face that is the edge between them. That means that there is a set of sites for which both are a balanced least squares assignment, so equally good. Now, that actually means that not only the sites for the construction of a power diagram can be the same, but actually the positions of the hyperplanes, the boundaries of the cells are going to be the same because the whole face is optimal. So this means that the edges of this polyhedron are going to work on only the items that are precisely on the boundary of the cells of the corresponding cell complex. So that's something really valuable. The difference between the left-hand and the right-hand clustering is just that some of these items on the boundary were moved between the clusters that share that boundary. Okay, so then the question is, what is it that we do with the items on the boundary? And that's essentially where the characterization of the set of circuits comes in. The circuits of both the partition polytopes and the transportation polytopes are what I'll call elementary movements. So what you do is you pick a subset of clusters, you pick an item from each of these clusters, and then you move them. So you should order these clusters. So you pick a subset of clusters, order them, pick an item from each cluster, and then move the cluster assignment. So for example, here you see this red line, the blue line, the elementary movement that takes the left clustering to the right-hand clustering is adding this blue point to the red cluster and adding this black point to the blue cluster. And there are two types of these movements. So sequential movements like these, or they could actually form a cycle which changes some cluster assignments. So this one, and this one, and keeps the cluster sizes the same. Okay, so I'm almost out of time, but I don't have much to go anyway. So there are some technical conditions on the cluster sizes and indecomposability of these elementary movements. So it's not okay to be able to break them up into smaller, shorter elementary movements that keep feasible clustering shapes. But that's really it. So the edges of a partition polytope are those elementary movements that only work on the items on the cell's boundary. Now, there's a really nice characterization. It does not mean that it's easy to find those. And that's why we're currently working on different ways of approximating this inner cone. So for example, by finding the convex hull of the clusters and then just picking items that are on the boundary of the convex hull and checking whether that gives such a movement. There are nice applications for this, but for time reasons, I'll skip over this. And I'll just tell you that there were two practical algorithms that came out of this. We can actually transform clusterings through a sequence of such elementary movements. So we can explicitly compute a sequence of elementary movements that takes one balanced least squares assignment to another one. And we are actually able to retain separability throughout by walking along the boundary of the partition polytope that they belong to. So it's possible to walk from one clustering to the other one and keeping the ability to form a separating cell complex at all stages of this process. Okay, so the idea to do this is walk along the boundary. Some of the balanced least squares assignment will not be on the boundary, will be in the interior, but we designed a combinatorial algorithm to transform those into a clustering that is on the boundary, and then you can apply that main part of the transition. So plenty of applications for knowing the vertices, knowing the edges, knowing the circuits of these partition polytopes, and that's something that in these past years has been one of my main interests. All right, so that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.